On International Women's Day, my husband sent me a text message that shattered our 5-year marriage. He wrote, "I am bringing 10 friends over for dinner tonight. Bacon apple pie for Tyler and a traditional French roast chicken for Everline. Do not embarrass me." I simply replied, "Sure." Yet when his affluent guests walked into my home a few hours later, what awaited them under the silver dining cloches caused a total absolute shock. My name is Zara, and at 32 years old I had mastered the art of playing the quiet, supportive wife to Marcus, a man who truly believed my greatest achievement in life was cooking his meals. Before I tell you how this dinner party destroyed his entire reality, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone of your true worth. The truth was, I was not just a home cook. I was the secret founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a multi-million-dollar food and supply chain empire. The conflict started that very morning. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany table inside a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The sun glared off the polished surface as I reviewed a $50 million acquisition contract. My lead corporate attorney, Ms. Sterling, sat beside me, sliding a gold pen across the table. We were just moments away from purchasing the parent company of the exact real estate firm, where my husband Marcus worked as a senior director. Just as my fingers wrapped around the pen, my phone buzzed violently against the wood. I glanced down at the screen. It was Marcus. I read his demanding text message again. Bacon apple pie for Tyler and a traditional French roast chicken for Everline. Do not embarrass me. He did not ask how my day was going. He did not say please. He issued an order to a woman he viewed as his subordinate. Ms. Sterling paused, adjusting her glasses. She caught a glimpse of the illuminated screen and sighed heavily. "Is Marcus throwing another one of his lavish dinner parties, Zara?" she asked. Her voice carried a mix of professional restraint and deep personal annoyance. She knew exactly who Marcus was. She knew that he constantly used our joint bank accounts to fund his luxurious lifestyle, accounts that I secretly replenished every single month while he bragged to his friends about being the sole provider. I set the gold pen down and leaned back in my leather chair. "Yes, he is bringing Tyler and Everline along with 8 other guests," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Taylor was his most toxic business partner, a man who constantly made inappropriate jokes at my expense. Everline was my white sister-in-law, who never missed an opportunity to deliver backhanded compliments about my background, my culture, and the neighborhood where I grew up. Ms. Sterling crossed her arms. "Zara, your husband does not even know that you are about to become his ultimate boss in exactly 10 minutes. Does he still think you are running a small neighborhood catering gig out of the kitchen?" "He thinks I am barefoot in the kitchen waiting for his commands," I said. I picked up my phone and opened the keyboard. I did not write a paragraph explaining my busy schedule. I did not remind him that today was a day meant to celebrate women. I simply typed the word "sure" and pressed send. Then I turned my attention back to the $50 million contract. I picked up the gold pen and signed my name on the dotted line. The ink was dark and permanent. The acquisition was officially complete. I now owned the very ground Marcus walked on. "Congratulations, Madam Chief Executive Officer," Ms. Sterling said, smiling warmly as she gathered the documents. "What is your first order of business for the new quarter?" I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. "I need a favor, Ms. Sterling. Cancel my afternoon meetings. Then I need you to go down to the legal archives and print out 10 specific files. I want full background checks, bank statements, and foreclosure notices. Do not put them in standard manila folders. I want them bound in premium black leather dossiers. Make them look like expensive high-end restaurant menus." Ms. Sterling raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "Are we serving legal papers for dinner tonight, Zara?" I walked toward the glass door and looked out over the city. "No, Ms. Sterling. We are serving the absolute truth. I am going to give Marcus an unforgettable feast. Have the dossiers delivered to my house by 4 o'clock. I have a dining room table to set." "Before you leave, Madam CEO," Ms. Sterling said, pulling one last beige folder from her leather briefcase. We need to verify the final asset freeze protocol on your joint accounts. Marcus made an unusually large transfer yesterday afternoon, and I want to ensure you are aware of it before we lock his access out completely. I paused with my hand hovering over the brass doorknob. My husband had never been good at hiding his financial incompetence, but his audacity always managed to surprise me. "What did he do this time, Miss Sterling?" I asked. She adjusted her silver-framed glasses and looked down at the highlighted bank statement. He withdrew exactly $100,000 from the primary joint checking account. The funds were wired directly to a luxury auto dealership in Connecticut and a boutique jeweler on Fifth Avenue. I walked back to the mahogany table and leaned against the edge. $100,000. Marcus had always been careless with money, but a six-figure withdrawal in a single afternoon was desperate even for him. He honestly thinks that money comes from his brilliant stock market investments, I said, shaking my head. He has no idea that my shell corporation has been quietly depositing those funds every month just to keep his credit score from collapsing. Ms. Sterling flipped the page. The jewelry receipt shows the purchase of a vintage diamond tennis bracelet. The auto dealership invoice is for a down payment on a customized Porsche Macan. I assume he is not buying these items as early anniversary gifts for you, Zara? A cold laugh escaped my chest. I looked out the glass walls at the bustling city below. No, Ms. Sterling. My anniversary is in October, and Marcus does not buy me diamonds. He buys me kitchen appliances and tells me to be grateful. The vintage bracelet and the luxury car are not for me. They are for Everline. Ms. Sterling looked up, her expression shifting from professional detachment to genuine disgust. Your sister-in-law. Why would your husband spend $100,000 of your hidden money on his brother's wife? Because Marcus is infected with a pathological need for validation, I explained. Everline comes from old money, or at least the illusion of it. She is white wealthy and drips with a suffocating superiority complex that constantly reminds Marcus he is an outsider. His brother David married into her family, and ever since that day, Marcus has been desperate to prove he belongs at their country club table. He buys her lavish gifts under the guise of family investments just to get a pat on the head. He wants her to see him as an equal. It is pathetic, Ms. Sterling murmured, closing the folder. He is draining your marital assets to buy the respect of a woman who openly disrespects you. Everline does not just disrespect me, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She views my existence in her family as a charitable tax write-off. She complains about the smell of my ethnic cooking. She asks if my hair is real every time we sit down for the holidays. And tonight, my husband wants me to roast a chicken for her, while he hands her the keys to a new Porsche, paid for by my sweat and blood. Ms. Sterling tapped her gold pen against the table. The trap is officially set, Zara. The moment I file these acquisition papers at 5 o'clock, your husband will technically become a low-level employee of your subsidiary company. And the moment I activate the asset freeze at 7 o'clock, his credit cards will turn into worthless pieces of plastic. I want those receipts blown up and printed in high resolution, I instructed, pointing at the folder. Put the diamond bracelet receipt as the first page in Everline's leather dossier. Put the Porsche invoice directly under it. When she opens her dinner plate tonight, I want her to see exactly whose money she has been flaunting. Consider it done, Miss Sterling replied, packing the documents into her briefcase. Will you need your private security detail stationed at the house tonight? Have 4 men wait in the kitchen, I said. Marcus has a temper when he feels cornered, and tonight I am taking away every corner he has left. I am stripping him of his job, his stolen money, and his fragile pride in front of the audience he values most. I pulled the boardroom door open. The air of the corporate hallway rushed in. I stepped out and looked back at my attorney one last time. Make sure the dossiers are bound perfectly, Ms. Sterling. It is going to be a very long, unforgettable dinner. When the iron gates of our property swung open, the brick facade of the house loomed ahead. Marcus loved to tell his friends that he bought this home with his bonuses. He loved to pretend he was the king of a castle he did not actually own. The truth was, my hidden corporate trust held the deed, and I paid the exorbitant property taxes every single quarter. I stepped out of the car and walked through the heavy double doors of the foyer. The smell of cinnamon, baked apples, and roasting herbs hit me immediately. I walked straight into the sprawling gourmet kitchen. A team of private caterers were frantically moving between the double ovens. They had followed Marcus' demands perfectly. A golden apple pie and a French roast chicken rested on the counter. I pulled a thick envelope of cash from my handbag and handed it to the head chef. "Thank you for your hard work." "But the menu has changed," I said. "Take this payment, pack up your knives, and leave the property immediately. Take all the food with you. My husband and his guests will not be eating tonight." The generous amount of cash quickly dissolved any questions. Within 15 minutes, the kitchen was completely empty. The delicious smells of roasted poultry and baked cinnamon faded away, replaced by the cold, sterile scent of granite cleaner and impending consequences. Right on cue, a courier van pulled up to the service entrance. A young man stepped out carrying a locked briefcase. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. "Ms. Sterling sends her regards," he said before disappearing. I carried the briefcase into the formal dining room and placed it at the head of the massive mahogany table. I snapped the locks open. Inside, resting on black velvet lining, were 10 premium leather-bound dossiers. They looked exactly like the expensive tasting menus you would find at a Michelin-starred restaurant. The leather was soft, the edges were perfectly stitched, and each one was embossed with a subtle gold crest. I began to set the table. I moved methodically around. The polished wood placing crisp white linen napkins, heavy crystal water glasses, and solid silver cutlery at each of the 10 seats. But instead of laying down fine china plates, I placed a leather dossier at every setting. I knew exactly where everyone would sit. Marcus always took the head of the table opposite me to play the role of the benevolent patriarch. Taylor always sat to his right, demanding the most attention. I took the dossier containing the wire fraud evidence and the Shell Company bank statements and placed it precisely at Taylor's seat. Everline always sat near the middle where she could hold court and project her voice over everyone else. I took the dossier containing her husband's bankruptcy records, the Hamptons foreclosure notice, and the purchase deed showing that I now owned her house. I placed it perfectly centered at her seat. Once all 10 dossiers were arranged, I walked over to the antique wooden sideboard and retrieved 10 heavy silver cloches. The polished metal domes were traditionally used in high-end hotels to keep gourmet meals hot before serving. I walked around the table and carefully lowered a silver cloche over each leather dossier. The metal clanged softly against the table's surface, hiding the legal landmines from view. I stepped back and admired my work. The dining room looked absolutely stunning. The crystal chandeliers caught the light reflecting off the silver domes. It looked like the setting for a perfect wealthy family gathering. No one would suspect that underneath those covers lay the absolute ruin of their personal and professional lives. 4 large men in tailored black suits stepped silently into the dining room from the kitchen hallway. My private security team had arrived. I nodded to the lead guard. "Lock the front gate after they enter." I instructed, "Disable the garage sensors. Nobody leaves this house until I say so." He nodded and motioned for his men to take their positions in the shadows of the hallway. Suddenly, the deep roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet evening. I recognized the obnoxious sound of Marcus Aston Martin speeding up the long driveway. The engine cut off abruptly, followed by the slamming of heavy car doors. Through the thick wood of the front doors, I could hear loud, arrogant voices echoing in the stone foyer. Taylor's booming laugh and Everlene's sharp, condescending tone pierced through the walls. My husband and his parasites had arrived expecting a lavish feast. I stood silently at the head of the table, smoothed my dress, and prepared to serve them. I took a slow, deep breath. finally knowing this night would completely change my life forever. The heavy oak front door swung open with a loud thud slamming against the entryway wall. A blast of cold evening air rushed into the warm foyer, carrying with it the overpowering scent of expensive cologne and cheap arrogance. Marcus marched into the house first, leading his pack of guests, like a triumphant king returning to his loyal subjects. His face was flushed from the cold and perhaps a few early drinks at the office. Right behind him was Taylor, his obnoxious business partner, whose booming voice bounced off the high ceiling. David followed closely behind Taylor, looking small and nervous as always. And then came Everline, draping herself in a heavy fur coat, stepping over the threshold as if she were gracing a peasant village with her royal presence. 6 other guests filed in behind them, laughing loudly at a joke Taylor had just made. They did not take off their shoes. They did not wipe their feet. They simply tracked the city streets directly onto my pristine hardwood floors. Marcus stopped in the middle of the foyer and finally noticed me standing quietly near the archway of the dining room. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my day was. Instead, he shrugged off his heavy wool winter coat, rolled it into a ball, and threw it directly at my chest. The heavy fabric hit me hard, forcing me to take a step back to catch my balance. The metal buttons scraped against my collarbone. It was a calculated move designed to immediately establish his dominance in front of his friends. He wanted them to see that in this house I was not his equal. I was his servant. I clutched the heavy coat in my hands, feeling the cold, damp fabric against my skin. A year ago, this simple act of disrespect would have sent me to the bedroom in tears. Today, it only fueled the burning fire of my impending revenge. Taylor let out a loud, obnoxious chuckle and slapped Marcus on the shoulder. He looked me up and down with a dismissive gaze that made my skin crawl. David refused to make eye contact with me, staring intently at his expensive leather shoes instead. The other guests exchanged amused glances, clearly enjoying the power dynamic Marcus was displaying. They were all complicit in his behavior. They thrived on it. They fed off the energy of belittling someone they deemed beneath them. I stood there holding the coat, absorbing their collective disrespect. I memorized every smirk and every condescending look. Marcus stepped closer to me, his breath smelling strongly of aged scotch. "Where are the appetizers?" he barked, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the foyer. "Taylor is starving. We have been working hard all day while you were sitting around here doing whatever it is you do. Do not just stand there looking stupid." He gestured aggressively toward the kitchen. "Bring out the food, Zara. We do not have all night to wait for you to figure out how to serve a simple meal. I want the drinks poured, and I want the plates on the table right now." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word in my defense. They were all waiting to see how the quiet, obedient wife would react to being publicly humiliated. I did not flinch. I did not let a single trace of anger show on my face. Instead, I slowly folded his coat over my arm and looked directly into his eyes. I let a warm, welcoming smile spread across my face, a smile so perfectly crafted and serene that it actually made Marcus pause for a fraction of a second in pure confusion. "I am so glad you are all finally here," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "Everything is completely ready for you." I extended my free hand toward the archway of the formal dining room, gesturing for the group to follow me. "Please come this way," I invited them. "The table is set, and your special dinner is waiting under the covers. Take your seats and make yourselves comfortable." Marcus puffed out his chest, clearly satisfied that his public display of authority had worked flawlessly. He led the group toward the dining room, barking at Taylor to grab a good seat. As the guests began to shuffle past me, Everline finally stepped into the light. She paused right next to me, deliberately invading my personal space. She slowly tilted her head back and dramatically sniffed the air, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in a tight look of profound disgust, fully preparing herself to deliver the very first sharp insult of this unforgettable evening together. The guests filtered into the formal dining room, their eyes immediately drawn to the shimmering silver cloches resting at each place setting. The heavy crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany table, but the atmosphere felt anything but inviting. Marcus directed everyone to their designated seats, acting like the grand master of a lavish feast. He took his position at the head of the table, gesturing for Taylor to sit to his right. Everline glided toward the center seat, her fur coat now draped carelessly over the back of her dining chair. Before even sitting down, she picked up the heavy crystal water glass and held it up to the light. She squinted her eyes, inspecting the pristine rim for imaginary smudges, making sure everyone noticed her high standards. Finding none, she set the glass back down with a sharp clink and finally took her seat. She crossed her legs and folded her hands over the crisp white linen napkin, resting her elbows on the table in a display of complete entitlement. She looked around the room, taking in the elegant decor, before her gaze finally landed on me, standing quietly at the opposite end of the table. "I hope you did not use too much of that ethnic seasoning," Zara Everline said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the other guests. She offered a tight, condescending smile that did not reach her cold blue eyes. "Marcus promised me a traditional French roast chicken tonight. You know our stomachs are quite sensitive to cheap ingredients. I really cannot handle anything too heavy or overpowering. It ruins the evening for everyone." The room went completely silent. David, her husband, visibly cringed and stared down at the silver cloche in front of him, pretending he had not heard his wife openly insult the host. Taylor leaned back in his chair, looking highly amused by the confrontation. Marcus did not correct her. He did not defend me at all. Instead, he took a sip of his water and offered Everline an apologetic look, as if my heritage was an unfortunate inconvenience he had to constantly manage to keep his friends comfortable. I felt a familiar sting of anger flare in my chest, but I kept my breathing steady. I had spent years swallowing these exact same microaggressions. Everline loved to use words like ethnic and cheap to remind me that no matter how big this house was, she still viewed me as someone who did not belong in her elite social circle. In the past, I would have scrambled to reassure her that I followed the French recipe perfectly. I would have desperately sought her approval. But tonight was incredibly different. Tonight, the raw ingredients I prepared were not meant to be easily digested by people like her. I rested my hands lightly on the back of my chair and met her gaze with absolute unwavering confidence. "Do not worry, Everlane," I replied, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any defensive tone. "I can assure you that absolutely nothing on this table tonight is cheap. In fact, I spent a great deal of time and a massive amount of money gathering the very best ingredients for you. Everything has been prepared specifically for your delicate palate. I think you will find the main course to be authentic and completely transparent. It is a recipe that has been developing for a very long time right under your nose." Everline blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm, assertive tone. She was used to me shrinking under her pointed insults. She opened her mouth to deliver another backhanded comment, perhaps a nasty remark about my lack of formal culinary training, but the words died in her throat. She shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, suddenly unsure of how to navigate a version of me that absolutely refused to play the role of the intimidated victim. Marcus frowned heavily, picking up on the subtle shift in the power dynamic. He hated when I spoke back to his guests. He opened his mouth to reassert control, to command me to stop talking and start serving, but he was abruptly interrupted. The loud clanking of heavy metal against crystal rang out sharply from the right side of the dining table. Taylor was impatiently tapping his thick silver salad fork against his water glass. He scowled at me, his face turning red with extreme annoyance. "Enough talking," he barked, slamming the fork down onto the table. "I did not come here to listen to two women bicker about spices. I came here tonight just for real food. Marcus told me you spent all afternoon baking. Just stop standing there like a useless statue and do your job. Tell me, where is the apple pie?" Taylor stared at me, his silver fork still clutched tightly in his massive fist. His demand hung in the air, heavy and incredibly disrespectful. Marcus immediately backed him up, eager to please his toxic business partner. Stop playing these stupid games, Zara, Marcus snapped, his voice cracking like a whip across the elegant dining room. Taylor asked you a very simple question. We have been waiting long enough. Take off these ridiculous metal covers and serve the hot food before I completely lose my temper. I did not move toward the kitchen to fetch a serving spoon. Instead, I slowly walked to the very head of the mahogany table, taking the empty space directly opposite my husband. I stood perfectly tall, smoothing the expensive black fabric of my custom-tailored dress. I let my cold eyes wander over the faces of the 10 privileged people sitting inside my house. They looked back at me with varying expressions of annoyance, profound confusion, and blatant mockery. Did you know that today is International Women's Day? I asked, my voice echoing softly against the high vaulted ceiling. A collective groan rippled through the seated guests. David rolled his eyes dramatically and took a large, desperate gulp of his red wine. Everline let out a sharp, theatrical sigh, as if my words were physically painful for her to endure. It is a day meant to recognize the silent, unseen labor of women. I continued, completely ignoring their rude reactions. For generations, women have been expected to stand quietly in the background. We are expected to cook the elaborate meals, clean up the massive messes, and secretly fund the fragile egos of the men who falsely claim to lead us. We are expected to smile brightly, while our own financial resources are drained to support the grand illusions built by those sitting at the head of the table. Marcus slammed his open hand down on the polished wood. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, his face turning a deep shade of crimson red. "Are you drunk on the cooking wine? Shut your mouth right now and serve the meal. You are embarrassing me in front of my most important colleagues." I kept my icy gaze locked on his face. "I am not embarrassing you, Marcus," I said, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper that carried through the silent room. "I am simply serving the ultimate truth. There is an old saying about reaping what you sow. For 5 entire years, I have planted seeds of extreme patience. I have watered the soil of this marriage with my own hidden resources while you proudly harvested all the credit. But the harvest season is finally here. Tonight, every single person sitting at this table is going to consume exactly what they have rightfully earned. Nothing more and nothing less. You demanded a feast. I have prepared a banquet of absolute reality." The guests exchanged highly confused and mocking glances. One of Marcus' colleagues whispered something foul to his wife, and she stifled a nasty laugh behind her linen napkin. They genuinely thought I was having a mental breakdown. They thought the pressure of being a perfect domestic servant had finally cracked my mind. Everline leaned over to David and muttered loud enough for the entire room to hear clearly. "I told you she was deeply unstable. This is exactly what happens when you marry someone with absolutely no class." Marcus stood up abruptly, his heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at me. "I am giving you one last warning, Zara," he shouted, his chest heaving with anger. "If you do not stop this insane rant right now, I will send you straight to the bedroom. You will stay up there until everyone leaves, and we will have a very serious conversation about your terrible behavior tomorrow. You are acting exactly like a hysterical child." I looked at the furious man I had married, the man who truly believed he held all the power in this room. He was trying to banish me to my room as if I were a disobedient teenager. He thought his booming voice and aggressive posture would force my instant compliance. He was incredibly wrong. I did not argue with his hollow threat. I did not raise my voice or defend my sanity to a table full of parasites. I simply broke eye contact with my husband and began to walk slowly down the right side of the long table. The room was dead silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the floorboards. I passed David, who stubbornly refused to look up. I passed Everline, who sneered at me in disgust. I stopped right next to Taylor. He looked up at me, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as I stepped into his personal space. I slowly reached out and placed my hand firmly on the curved metal handle of the silver cloche, resting directly in front of him. With one swift motion, I lifted the heavy silver cloche. The polished metal dome cleared the table, revealing the thick black leather dossier resting on the white linen tablecloth. There was no warm baked apple pie. There was no sweet cinnamon steam rising into the air to satisfy his demanding appetite. Instead, sitting perfectly centered on top of the embossed leather cover was a bright red plastic flash drive. Underneath the drive, a thick stack of financial bank statements printed on crisp white paper spilled out from the dark folder. Heavy yellow highlighter ink marked multiple lines of transactions across every single visible page. Taylor stared at the red flash drive for a long moment. He blinked his thick eyelashes several times, as if trying to adjust his vision to a sudden bright light. A slow, uncertain grin crept across his face, and he let out a short, highly nervous laugh. "What is this, Zara?" he asked, looking back up at me with a condescending smirk. "Is this some kind of twisted corporate joke? Did Marcus put you up to this little stunt? Because if he did, it is not very funny at all. I am incredibly hungry from working all day, and I absolutely do not have the patience for your bizarre parlor games." I did not smile back at him. I reached down and picked up the very first page of the highlighted bank statements, holding it up to the light of the crystal chandelier. "This is your special dessert, Taylor," I said, keeping my voice absolutely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Let us take a close look at the ingredients together." I looked down at the highlighted numbers and began to read aloud, clearly and slowly. Account routing number, ending in 4729. Registered to a limited liability company called Blue Horizon Consulting. Date of initial incorporation, March 14th, exactly 3 years ago. Taylor immediately stopped laughing. His face went entirely slack, losing all of its previous arrogant color. Across the long dining table, Marcus suddenly dropped his crystal water glass. It hit the mahogany wood with a heavy, sickening thud, spilling ice and cold water all over his expensive suit pants, but he did not even move to wipe it up. I turned to the second page and continued reading the undeniable evidence. Monthly deposits of exactly $45,000 wired from the local union pension fund directly into the Blue Horizon corporate account. From there, the stolen funds are immediately transferred via wire fraud to a secondary offshore blind trust located in the Cayman Islands. Would you like me to read those specific offshore account numbers too, Taylor, or do you already have them memorized for your retirement plan? The elegant dining room suddenly felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the air. Everline stared at Taylor, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. David shifted his eyes back and forth between Marcus and his business partner, sensing the immense legal danger radiating through the room. The other 6 wealthy guests sat completely frozen in their heavy wooden chairs, paralyzed by the sudden revelation of severe federal financial crimes being loudly announced over a dinner table. "You are supposed to be a senior partner at a highly respected commercial real estate firm." "Taylor," I said, dropping the heavy paper back onto the table. "Yet you and my husband have spent the last 36 months quietly siphoning millions of dollars from the retirement funds of hardworking union construction workers. You purposely set up fake vendor contracts. You billed the vulnerable pension fund for phantom consulting services that absolutely no one ever performed. And then you funneled that stolen money straight into your own pockets to fund your expensive sports cars, your luxury island vacations, and your pathetic gambling habits." Marcus finally found his voice. He stood up quickly, gripping the sharp edge of the table until his knuckles turned completely white. "Shut up, Zara!" he yelled, his voice shaking with absolute terror and desperate rage. "Shut your mouth right now before you ruin everything. You do not know what you are talking about. You broke into my private home office and you stole highly confidential client files. That is a federal crime. I will have you arrested and thrown in prison for corporate espionage." I slowly turned my calm gaze to my panicked husband. "You cannot arrest the legal owner of your own company, Marcus," I reminded him softly. "And these files are not confidential anymore. They are the exact paper trail of a massive organized embezzlement scheme." Taylor suddenly stood up violently, knocking his heavy dining chair backward onto the hard floor. "You are bluffing," he screamed loudly, pointing directly at my calm face. "I am not bluffing, Taylor," I replied, keeping my hands perfectly still by my sides. My voice was a low, steady hum that easily cut through his frantic screaming. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my tailored black dress and pulled out a small, sleek, smart home remote control. I held it up so the crystal chandelier light caught the dark polished glass of the device. Everyone at the table watched my hand with wide, terrified eyes, as if I were holding a live grenade. Without breaking eye contact with Taylor, I pressed the center button. Instantly, the expensive surround sound system built directly into the dining room ceiling came to life. A brief crackle of static filled the tense air before a crisp, clear audio recording began to play. The voices echoing off the mahogany walls were unmistakable. It was Marcus and Taylor. Their conversation was recorded just 3 weeks ago inside my husband's private home office. The same office I supposedly never entered because I was too busy cleaning the kitchen. "We need a fall guy," Taylor's recorded voice boomed through the overhead speakers, sounding cold and incredibly calculating. "The union auditors are asking too many questions about the Blue Horizon invoices. If they dig deep enough, they will find the Cayman accounts, and we are both going to federal prison." "Then we give them a target," my husband's voice replied from the speakers, sounding desperate and cowardly. "What about young Michael from the accounting department? He is inexperienced, and he just signed off on the last batch of quarterly expense reports without double-checking the vendor list. We can easily manipulate the digital timestamps to make it look like he authorized the offshore wire transfers. We bury him with fake emails and we walk away clean." "He is a 24-year-old kid with a newborn baby," Taylor's voice answered with a cruel laugh. "He will not have the money to hire a good defense lawyer. He will take a plea deal just to reduce his sentence. It is the perfect setup, Marcus. We pin the missing millions entirely on Michael, and we shut down Blue Horizon before the federal investigators even know what hit them." I pressed the center button again, and the audio abruptly cut off, plunging the dining room back into a suffocating dead silence. The heavy truth of their incredibly malicious plot hung over the dinner table like a toxic cloud. They were not just stealing money from hardworking people. They were actively conspiring to completely destroy the life of an innocent young father just to protect their own greedy interests. The expressions around the table shifted from confusion to pure horror. David stared at his brother with complete disgust. Evelyn looked physically sick, her face entirely drained of color as she finally realized the massive scale of the criminal enterprise funding her luxurious lifestyle. The other 6 guests subtly pushed their heavy chairs away from the table, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of this dinner party. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, looking exactly like a dead man. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He opened his mouth to formulate a lie, but no words came out. His entire fake empire had just crumbled into dust right before his eyes. Taylor, however, did not freeze. Survival instincts kicked in, replacing his arrogant posture with the frantic movements of a trapped animal. He spun around and lunged toward the foyer, desperately grabbing for the heavy wool coat he had thrown over a chair earlier. "I am leaving!" he shouted frantically, stumbling over his own expensive leather shoes. "You are completely insane, Zara. I am not staying here to listen to these fabricated recordings. I am calling my legal team right now." I remained perfectly still at the head of the table. I did not run after him. I did not raise my voice to stop him. Instead, I simply opened the security application on my mobile phone and pressed the red lockdown icon. A loud mechanical hum vibrated through the walls of the dining room. Heavy, reinforced steel security shutters automatically rolled down over the large custom windows, sealing the room in a metal fortress. The electronic deadbolts on the heavy oak front doors snapped shut with a resounding and final click. Taylor yanked violently on the heavy brass door handle, but it refused to budge. He spun around his chest, heaving with absolute panic as the grim reality of his situation finally set in. "You cannot leave, Taylor," I announced, my voice echoing coldly in the securely sealed room. I forwarded that audio file and the complete bank statements to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 20 minutes ago. The armed agents are on their way. The armed agents are on their way. The moment those words left my mouth, chaos erupted at Tyler's end of the table. Tyler began pacing frantically in the limited space like a trapped animal. He was muttering rapidly about calling his defense lawyers, about destroying his hard drives, and about how he was not going to spend his life rotting inside a federal prison. The other guests were panicked. Some frantically dialed their mobile phones trying to get a cellular signal through the reinforced steel security shutters. Others loudly demanded that I open the front doors immediately, threatening to sue me for false imprisonment. Marcus remained unnervingly quiet for a brief, terrifying moment, staring blankly at the red flash drive. Then his shocked silence broke. He lunged forcefully across the polished mahogany table, knocking over crystal water glasses and silver cloches in his desperate path. He grabbed my left arm violently. His thick fingers dug deeply into my bare skin, his grip incredibly tight and completely unforgiving. His eyes were entirely wild with a dangerous mixture of intense fear and uncontrollable rage. "Listen to me, everyone," Marcus yelled, physically turning his head to address his terrified colleagues. "Do not listen to a single word she says. Zara is completely mentally unstable. She has been suffering from severe clinical paranoia for months. She used artificial intelligence software to doctor that audio recording. None of it is real. She is having a massive psychotic break right in front of us, and we need to remain calm." He tightened his bruising grip on my arm, trying to aggressively force me into frightened submission. "She fabricated those detailed bank statements because she is insanely jealous of my corporate success," Marcus continued, his voice echoing loudly. "She is a very sick woman who needs immediate psychiatric help. There is absolutely no union pension embezzlement, and there is definitely no federal investigation happening here today. She is just trying to destroy my professional reputation." I did not pull away from his painful grasp. I did not scream for help or beg him to let me go. I simply looked down at his heavy hand gripping my arm and then looked directly back into his sweating face. "You are sweating profusely, Marcus," I noted calmly, my steady voice easily slicing right through his frantic lies. "Innocent men do not sweat like pigs when falsely accused of doctoring audio files. And truly innocent men do not physically assault their wives in front of corporate witnesses." Before Marcus could utter another desperate lie, the heavy wooden door leading to the kitchen swung open. 4 very large men dressed in immaculate tailored black suits stepped silently into the elegant dining room. They moved with absolute tactical precision and undeniable physical authority. These were not cheap hired caterers or random security guards. They were highly trained professional operatives, waiting patiently for my silent command. The lead guard, a tall man with a cold, stern face, closed the distance between Marcus and me in 3 quick strides. He did not say a warning word. He simply reached out and clamped his massive hand directly onto Marcus' right shoulder. The physical force of the grip caused Marcus to instantly release my bruised arm. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly in pure terror between the 4 imposing men. "Sit down," the lead guard commanded, his voice devoid of any human emotion. He pushed Marcus firmly in the chest, forcing him to stumble backward until the back of his knees hit his heavy dining chair. Marcus collapsed heavily into the leather seat, his chest heaving rapidly, his previous aggressive bravado completely evaporating under the physical threat of the security detail. The entire dining room went dead silent once again. The wealthy guests stared in absolute frozen shock at the 4 strong men standing like giant stone statues around my defeated husband. The severe reality of the extremely terrifying situation was finally sinking deep into their minds. This was definitely not a simple domestic dispute. This was a carefully executed trap, and I was the only person holding all the keys to their freedom. The heavy, suffocating silence was suddenly shattered by a loud, high-pitched screech coming from the center of the table. Everline stood up abruptly, her face completely pale and contorted with extreme aristocratic indignation. She pointed a visibly trembling manicured finger directly at Marcus and then turned her highly furious gaze to her cowardly husband David. "David, do something!" Everline shrieked, her voice cracking violently with sheer panic. "I cannot believe you dragged me into this complete nightmare. Fire Marcus right now. Strip him of his corporate title and get us out of this terrifying house immediately. I absolutely refuse to sit here and eat my dinner tonight in a complete madhouse." Everline snatched her incredibly expensive fur coat from the back of her heavy leather dining chair. She slung it forcefully over her shoulder with an exaggerated motion of extreme disgust. She glared at me, her pale blue eyes practically vibrating with unchecked rage and deeply ingrained racial entitlement. "Open these steel security shutters right this second, Zara," she commanded, her voice echoing sharply against the polished mahogany walls. "You have absolutely no legal right to hold me hostage inside your tacky little suburban home. I come from a wealthy family that practically helped build this entire city from the ground up. My grandfather founded the exclusive country club where your pathetic criminal husband constantly begs to play golf every single weekend. If you do not unlock that front door immediately, my powerful family lawyers will completely destroy your entire pathetic life. They will bury you in so much aggressive litigation that you will be entirely bankrupt and living on the streets by tomorrow morning." David reached out with a violently trembling hand, trying to gently grab his wife's arm. "Please, Everline, just sit down and be quiet," he whispered desperately, clearly terrified of the 4 incredibly large security guards standing silently nearby. "We do not want to make things any worse than they already are right now." Everline violently jerked her arm away from her weak husband. "Do not, you dare tell me to be quiet, David." She snapped, her face flushing a deep shade of indignant, angry red. "I am not going to cower in fear just because this arrogant woman hired some cheap muscle to intimidate us over a dinner table. She is absolutely nothing. She has always been nothing but a mistake. She is just a glorified housemaid who got incredibly lucky when Marcus decided to drastically lower his high standards. I am going back to my massive estate in the Hamptons tonight, and I am never stepping foot in this hideous house ever again." I listened to her completely unhinged rant without interrupting a single word. Her desperate need to loudly assert her social superiority was entirely predictable and remarkably pathetic. I slowly began to walk down the left side of the long, polished dining table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the dark hardwood floor, measuring the heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed her loud, arrogant outburst. I casually passed the highly terrified corporate guests, who were now pressing themselves tightly against the high backs of their chairs. I walked directly behind David, who was staring down at his empty porcelain plate, looking entirely defeated and physically sick. Finally, I stopped moving when I was standing directly behind Everline. I could easily smell the strong floral scent of her incredibly expensive designer perfume. It was a thick, suffocating fragrance meant to cleverly mask the incredibly ugly reality of her deeply toxic personality. "You are deeply obsessed with the grand illusion of your own superiority." "Everlyn?" I said, my voice low and dangerously calm, just inches from her right ear. She stiffened instantly, her narrow shoulders tensing defensively under the heavy fur coat, but she stubbornly refused to turn around and look at my face. "You walk into my private home and you openly insult the hot food I prepare. You make nasty, underhanded comments about my rich cultural heritage, and you constantly treat my very existence as a personal insult to your pristine high society pedigree. You honestly believe that your precious generational wealth makes you completely untouchable by the normal rules of human decency." Everline let out a short, highly bitter laugh. "It actually does make me untouchable," she sneered, staring straight ahead at the polished silver cloche resting on the table directly in front of her. "You can lock all the doors and play your little security guard games all night long, Zara, but it changes absolutely nothing about who we are. Tomorrow morning I will wake up in my $10 million beachfront mansion, and you will still be trapped in this miserable, pathetic little life, serving a corrupt man who steals money just to buy me vintage diamond bracelets." I smiled a cold, entirely humorless smile, looking down at the top of her perfectly styled, expensive blonde hair. You are incredibly confident about a lavish future that simply does not exist anymore, I told her smoothly without raising my voice. You loudly boast about your untouchable status, but your entire reality is built on a crumbling, weak foundation of hidden lies and massive unpaid debts. You absolutely love to flaunt your generational wealth, but you never even bother to check if the family bank accounts are actually full. Everline finally turned her head to look up at me. What are you talking about? She whispered. I slowly lifted the silver cloche up. I slowly lifted the silver cloche up. The polished metal dome moved away to reveal a sleek black leather dossier just like the one sitting in front of Tyler. But the papers resting on top of Everline's dossier were entirely different. There was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy formal paper, secured with a stark red legal seal. At the very top of the stack was a highly official document bearing the bold, heavily capitalized heading of the state Supreme Court. Right below that intimidating header, printed in large, unmistakable black ink, were the words, Notice of Default and Final Foreclosure. Underneath that terrifying notice lay the original property deed to her precious $10 million beachfront mansion. Everlane stared down at the documents. Her perfectly manicured hands hovered awkwardly in the air. Her initial expression of aristocratic rage slowly morphed into one of profound, genuine confusion. She blinked several times, leaning slightly closer to the table as if her expensive contact lenses were suddenly failing her. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, her voice losing some of its sharp edge. "Why do you have a fake copy of the deed to my house, Zara? This is completely absurd. You think printing out some fake internet documents is going to scare me tonight?" I reached out and gently tapped my index finger directly on the red legal seal. "These documents are absolutely real, Everline," I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm and level. "That seal is straight from the county clerk office. I highly suggest you read the second page, the one detailing the massive unpayable liens placed against your pristine property. You see, Everline, you love to brag about your flawless life and your generational wealth, but you have been living completely in the dark for a very long time. While you were busy taking expensive shopping trips to Paris and hosting lavish charity galas, your husband was incredibly busy losing every single penny you thought you possessed." Everlane scoffed loudly, waving her hand dismissively. "David is a highly successful investment banker," she countered, though a slight tremor of uncertainty now laced her words. "He manages millions of dollars for top clients. He would never let anything happen to our family estate." I slowly walked around the back of her chair and stood next to David. David had not moved a single muscle since the silver cloche was lifted. He was staring straight ahead at the mahogany wood, looking like a man who was about to face a brutal firing squad. "Your husband has not been a successful investment banker for over 2 years, Everline," I announced loudly enough for every terrified guest in the room to hear clearly. "He was quietly let go from his prestigious firm 24 months ago, after they discovered his severe offshore gambling addiction. Did he forget to mention that minor detail to you? Did he forget to tell you about the massive amounts of money he lost playing high-stakes baccarat on illegal online servers located in Macau and the Bahamas?" The color completely drained from Everline's face. She looked at the heavy stack of legal papers again, her eyes desperately scanning the dense paragraphs of financial ruin. "He completely drained your joint savings accounts within the first 6 months." I continued, relentlessly delivering the hard, absolute facts. "When that money was finally gone, he secretly mortgaged your beautiful Hamptons estate to the absolute maximum legal limit. He took out massive, high-interest loans from extremely shady private lenders just to cover his mounting gambling debts. He desperately chased his massive losses, convinced he could win it all back before you ever noticed the missing funds. But the house always wins, Everline, and David lost absolutely everything. Your entire lavish lifestyle has been completely funded by toxic, unpayable debt for the past 2 years." Everline sat frozen in her expensive leather chair. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. The grand illusion of her superior high society life was rapidly shattering into a million sharp pieces right in front of her eyes. The designer dress she was wearing, the luxury sports car parked in my driveway, the massive beachfront estate she constantly bragged about, they were all completely gone. They belonged entirely to the banks and the aggressive private creditors now. "You are lying," she finally whispered, her voice incredibly frail and completely devoid of its former arrogance. "David would never do that to me. We are wealthy. We are completely untouchable." I did not argue with her desperate, pathetic denial. I simply took a step back and gestured toward the silent man sitting beside her. "If you truly believe I am lying, Everline, I strongly suggest you ask him yourself," I said smoothly. "Ask the man who blatantly forged your signature on the second mortgage application." Everline slowly turned her head. The heavy fur coat slipped slightly off her tense, trembling shoulders. She looked down at David. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops of moisture beading on his pale forehead and rolling quickly down his neck. His hands were gripping the sharp edge of the dining table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was staring intensely at his empty porcelain dinner plate, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with his devastated wife. He was staring intensely at his empty porcelain dinner plate, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with his devastated wife. Everline let out a sudden sharp sound that was half gasp and half scream. She brought her manicured hands down incredibly hard on the heavy mahogany dining table, causing the crystal water glasses to violently rattle against the polished wood. "Look at me, David!" she shrieked, her voice completely losing its carefully cultivated, polished, aristocratic edge. "Tell me she is lying to me right now. Tell me you did not gamble away our entire financial future on stupid internet card games and shady offshore bets." David simply squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look up. A single heavy drop of sweat rolled off the tip of his nose and landed directly on the crisp white linen napkin resting on his lap. His shoulders slumped forward in absolute defeat. He could not say a single word in his own defense, because every single word printed in that black leather dossier was the absolute terrifying truth. When David refused to answer, Everline suddenly snapped her head back toward me. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, and her chest heaved wildly under her incredibly expensive designer dress. "So what?" she screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "So what if things got a little tight financially for a few months? You think this stupid piece of paper actually means anything in the real world, Zara? We are the Millers. My wealthy family has been banking with the exact same elite financial institutions for over 3 straight generations. My grandfather plays golf with the president of the bank every single Sunday morning. All David has to do is pick up the phone, make one simple phone call, and they will easily give us a 6-month extension. They will instantly restructure the entire loan just like they always do for people in our exclusive social tax bracket. We are completely untouchable, and you are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to scare us with standard legal paperwork." I slowly shook my head, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. I looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. "You really do not understand how the modern financial world actually works, do you, Everline?" I said, keeping my tone completely even and perfectly calm. "The prestigious bank your grandfather played golf with does not own your massive toxic mortgage anymore. They dropped your highly defaulted account many months ago. When a borrower completely stops paying on massive high-interest luxury loans, the bank absolutely does not care about your precious family name or your elite country club memberships. They only care about aggressively cutting their immediate financial losses. They bundle up the bad debt and they sell it off to the highest bidder at a very steep discount." Everline blinked rapidly, her false aristocratic confidence beginning to violently crack once again. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fresh panic. "The bank would never dare sell our historic family mortgage to some random stranger." "They did not sell it to a stranger, Everline," I corrected her, stepping slightly closer to her chair. "They sold it to a highly aggressive private debt collection firm. a massive firm that absolutely specializes in quietly acquiring distressed luxury real estate portfolios across the entire East Coast. I strongly suggest you look closely at the second page of that official foreclosure notice. Look right at the bottom where the new legal owner of your massive debt is officially listed in black ink. Everline frantically snatched the heavy paper from the leather dossier. Her trembling fingers traced down the dense legal text until she reached the bold black ink at the very bottom of the page. She read the words out loud, her voice barely above a raspy, terrified whisper. Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. She looked up at me, her face completely blank. "Who is Apex Holdings?" she asked, sounding entirely defeated. "Is that one of Taylor's shady shell companies? Did my corrupt husband sell our massive beachfront estate to his own criminal brother?" Marcus, who was still sitting frozen in his chair under the watchful eyes of my massive security guards, suddenly let out a strangled gasp. He recognized the corporate name immediately. It was the exact same parent company he had been desperately trying to secure a major commercial real estate deal with all year long. "No, Everline," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "Marcus and David have absolutely nothing to do with Apex Holdings. They do not have the capital, the intelligence, or the power to run a massive corporate entity like that." I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my tailored black dress. My fingers wrapped tightly around cold, heavy metal. I pulled my hand out and held it directly over Everline's empty porcelain dinner plate. I opened my hand and dropped a heavy set of shiny brass keys. They hit the expensive china with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed violently through the dead, silent dining room. "I am Apex Holdings," I announced, looking directly into her terrified, widening eyes. "I bought your massive debt last week and the foreclosure was finalized this morning. I own your house, Everline." I watched her process the sheer magnitude of her absolute ruin. "For 2 entire years you paraded around this city acting like absolute royalty." I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. "You constantly looked down your perfectly sculpted nose at my clothes, my house, and my rich cultural heritage. But let us talk about your clothes, Everline. That authentic vintage Chanel flat bag you brought to Thanksgiving dinner last year, the one you made a massive point to loudly tell everyone cost $12,000. David bought that exact bag using a high-interest credit card that my holding company quietly paid off just so your account would not go into total default. That custom white Porsche Macan you drove here tonight, the one parked in my driveway leaking oil on my expensive paving stones. Marcus used my hard-earned corporate dividends to secretly cover the massive down payment just to impress you. Every single luxury ski vacation to Aspen, every single sip of expensive vintage champagne you consumed at your elite country club, every single pair of designer red-bottom heels you wore to walk all over me, they were all entirely funded by my money. I have been secretly subsidizing your arrogant, pathetic existence for 24 straight months." The harsh reality of her utter financial dependence finally broke her completely. Everline suffered a total, terrifying narcissistic collapse right there at the elegant dining table. The pristine mask of her wealthy white privilege violently shattered, leaving behind absolutely nothing but raw, ugly desperation. She let out a guttural, animalistic scream that echoed sharply against the crystal chandeliers above us. "You filthy, lying witch!" she shrieked, her face twisting into a hideous mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She grabbed the sharp edge of the mahogany table, pushed off forcefully with her expensive heels, and lunged violently across the space separating us. Her manicured fingers were curled into vicious claws, aimed directly at my eyes. I did not even blink. I did not need to step back. Before she could even cross halfway, the lead security guard moved with terrifying, blinding speed. He stepped smoothly in front of me, raising one massive, solid arm to block her frantic path. Everline crashed hard into him, like a fragile, panicked bird hitting a thick, solid brick wall. The severe physical impact knocked the breath entirely out of her lungs. The guard easily grabbed her by the trembling shoulders and forcefully shoved her back toward her designated seat. She stumbled wildly, her expensive heels twisting painfully underneath her shifting weight until she crashed heavily back into her thick leather dining chair. Humiliated, physically restrained, and entirely stripped of her false power, Everlane completely lost her mind. She desperately needed a physical target for her explosive, unhinged rage, and she immediately found the closest, weakest one available. She whipped her blonde head around and locked her crazed eyes on her cowardly husband. David was still cowering in his seat, trembling uncontrollably and sweating profusely. "You pathetic, useless loser!" Everline screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. She scrambled frantically to her feet, leaned aggressively over the table, and slapped him directly across the face. The sharp, violent smack echoed like a gunshot through the silent dining room. David gasped, raising his shaking hands to protect his face, but she slapped him again, even harder this time. "You completely ruined my life!" She wailed, heavy tears of pure narcissistic rage finally streaming down her flushed cheeks, completely ruining her expensive, flawless makeup. "You promised me a perfect, wealthy life, and you threw it all away on stupid, illegal gambling websites. You made me completely dependent on this despicable woman." She hit him a third time, her heavy diamond rings tearing a small, bloody scratch across his pale, sweating cheek. The other wealthy guests watched in horrified, absolute silence, entirely paralyzed by the brutal domestic violence unfolding right in front of their eyes. Marcus sat completely frozen in his chair, too terrified of my security guards to intervene and save his own brother. I watched the pathetic spectacle for a few long moments before I finally decided to put an end to her miserable performance. I raised my hand slightly, and the security guards immediately stepped forward, pulling the hysterical, screaming woman away from her bleeding husband. "Stop screaming, Everline!" I commanded, my voice cutting sharply through her chaotic, endless wailing. "You are completely wasting your breath here, and you are running out of valuable time." She struggled weakly against the massive guard holding her arms, but stopped yelling, panting heavily, as she glared at me with absolute venom. "You really think the worst part of your night is finding out I own your mortgage?" I asked her, a cold, confident smile finally touching my lips. "You are severely mistaken. The foreclosure was legally finalized early this morning, which means you are officially trespassing on my private property. Right at this very second, the county sheriff is standing at your Hamptons estate with a professional eviction crew. They are currently drilling through your expensive custom locks and throwing your designer clothes into garbage bags right on the front lawn." While Everline sat there completely paralyzed by the image of her expensive life being tossed onto the grass, a sudden scraping noise drew my attention toward the far end of the dining table. Two of Marcus' corporate colleagues' men, who had happily eaten my food and laughed at my expense for years, were slowly pushing their heavy wooden chairs backward. They were trying to use Everline's dramatic breakdown as a convenient distraction to quietly slip away into the shadows of the hallway. "I am afraid the evening is not quite over yet, gentlemen," I announced, my voice instantly freezing them in their tracks. "Where do you think you are going tonight? The steel shutters are tightly down and the front doors are completely locked. Please sit back down right now. You have not even touched your special meals." The first man, Richard, swallowed hard. He was sitting next to his elegant wife. "Open your cloche, Richard," I commanded, pointing directly at his plate. He hesitated, his hands trembling visibly under the bright crystal lights. When he finally lifted the silver dome, his wife let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Resting on top of his black leather dossier was a thick stack of high-resolution glossy photographs. I did not even need to read the financial documents for him. The pictures completely spoke for themselves. They clearly showed Richard walking into a luxury boutique hotel downtown, arm in arm with his 22-year-old administrative assistant. Underneath the explicit photos were printed copies of the incredibly expensive hotel receipts and the thousands of dollars in diamond jewelry he had purchased for his young mistress using his corporate expense account. His wife snatched the photos from the table, her eyes widening in absolute horror and pure betrayal. "You told me you were working late on the corporate merger," she screamed, hitting him forcefully on the shoulder with her expensive designer clutch purse. "I gave up my entire career to raise your children, and you are spending our money on a girl who is barely out of college." Richard scrambled backward, knocking his chair over, trying desperately to avoid his wife's furious blows. While Richard's wife began loudly demanding an immediate divorce right there at the dinner table, I calmly turned my attention to the second man trying to escape. Bradley was the senior portfolio manager at Marcus' firm, and a man who prided himself on his untouchable financial brilliance. "Open yours, Bradley," I instructed, my tone offering absolutely zero mercy to him. He practically ripped the silver dome off his plate, desperately hoping to find something less damaging than what his colleague just received. Instead, he found a thick stack of printed email chains and highly confidential financial spreadsheets. "You dumped 50,000 shares of a major tech startup exactly 2 days before they announced a massive product recall," I explained smoothly, watching his arrogant face turn a sickly shade of pale gray. "You used illegal insider information provided by a corrupt board member, and you arrogantly thought you covered your digital tracks perfectly, but you did not cover them well enough." I forwarded that exact email chain to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier this afternoon. They freeze corporate accounts much faster than the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Bradley. Your entire offshore portfolio is probably completely locked down right now. You are going to lose your financial licenses, your luxurious home, and your freedom. Bradley let out a pathetic whimper, clutching his chest as if having a heart attack. He slumped forward, resting his head on the polished wood, absolutely devastated. Richard's wife was now screaming hysterically, throwing the glossy infidelity photos directly into her cheating husband's face as he begged her to lower her voice. Evelyn was still sobbing loudly into her hands while David sat beside her, staring blankly at the wall, completely broken and defeated by his massive gambling debts. Taylor was pacing frantically near the locked front door, muttering insanely to himself about hiring the best criminal defense attorneys in the country to fight the federal fraud charges. Marcus was slumped in his chair, utterly paralyzed, watching his entire fake world collapse in absolute ruins before him. The elegant dining room had completely devolved into a chaotic, brutal war zone of loud yelling, bitter crying, and vicious accusations. The people who had walked into my home acting like untouchable royalty were now tearing each other apart like desperate wild animals trapped in a cage. I slowly walked back to my seat at the head of the table. I picked up my heavy crystal glass filled with incredibly expensive red wine. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, complex flavor, as I stood in complete silence and proudly watched the absolute destruction of my arrogant enemies. As I lowered my wine glass, the sudden sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed through the room. Marcus had finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His face was a deep, violently flushed red, an ugly color fueled by absolute humiliation and desperate rage. He raised both of his heavy fists and brought them crashing down onto the polished mahogany table with terrifying force. The violent impact sent a crystal water glass toppling over, instantly shattering it into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces across the white linen tablecloth. Water and broken glass spilled dangerously close to his empty porcelain plate, but he did not care. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you have won, Zara?" he screamed, his voice cracking with intense fury. "You think you can just orchestrate this entire insane theatrical production and completely ruin my professional life without facing any severe consequences? You are nothing but a delusional high school educated home cook who somehow managed to get incredibly lucky." I set my wine glass down and looked at him, maintaining my absolute composure. He pointed a trembling, bloody finger at me, having cut his own knuckle on the shattered crystal glass. "You stood in my kitchen for 5 years, making my meals and washing my clothes," he continued, shouting at the top of his lungs. "You do not have the basic intelligence to build a massive corporate empire like Apex Holdings entirely on your own. You clearly hired some shady lawyers and used my hard-earned money to fund this entire pathetic revenge fantasy, but you made a massive, fatal mistake tonight, Zara. You completely forgot who you are married to. I am married to a cowardly man who steals from union pension funds." I replied, my voice completely smooth and unaffected by his aggressive outburst. Marcus slammed his hand on the table again, ignoring the sharp pain. "I am a senior director at a highly prestigious commercial real estate firm," He roared desperately, trying to reclaim his shattered authority in front of his ruined colleagues. I know exactly how corporate law works. I know exactly how marital assets are divided in this state. If you truly own Apex Holdings, and you built it during our 5-year marriage, then guess what, my sweet delusional wife? Half of that multi-million-dollar corporate empire legally belongs to me. David and Everline briefly stopped their vicious arguing, turning their heads to listen to Marcus. A tiny, pathetic glimmer of false hope flashed across Everline's tear-stained face. If Marcus could successfully sue me for half of my massive fortune, then maybe he could pay off David's disastrous gambling debts and save her precious Hampton's estate. I am filing for divorce the absolute second I walk out of this house, Marcus declared, puffing out his chest with a false sense of immense power. I am going to hire the most ruthless, aggressive divorce attorneys in the entire country. They are going to completely tear apart your hidden shell companies and expose every single financial secret you have been keeping from me. I am going to take half of your corporate dividends, half of your real estate portfolio, and half of every single penny you have hidden in your secret bank accounts. By the time my legal team is completely finished with you, Zara, you will be entirely bankrupt and begging for a minimum wage job sweeping the floors of my new office. The room fell completely silent once again. The terrified guests watched closely, waiting to see how I would react to his massive legal threat. Marcus stood tall, breathing heavily, a smug, arrogant smirk slowly returning to his flushed face. He genuinely believed he had just played a brilliant, unbeatable trump card. He honestly thought the American legal system would automatically protect his toxic male ego and reward his years of financial abuse. You are incredibly predictable, Marcus, I said slowly, shaking my head in pure, genuine pity. You always rely on threats of legal action when you completely lose control of a situation, but you are forgetting one extremely important detail about our marriage. I reached my hand into the thick leather dossier resting safely beside my dinner plate. My fingers bypassed the bank statements and the corporate acquisition documents. I reached all the way down to the very bottom of the thick file and pulled out a crisp, heavy stack of legal papers bound together with a dark blue ribbon. I held the document up under the bright crystal chandelier light so he could clearly see the bold black text printed on the very first page. Do you remember signing this prenuptial agreement exactly 5 years ago, Marcus? I asked him very softly. Do you remember signing this prenuptial agreement exactly 5 years ago? Marcus, I asked him very softly. He stared at the dark blue ribbon binding the thick stack of legal paper. I could clearly see the exact moment the distant memory registered in his panicking brain. 5 years ago, he was a highly arrogant junior executive desperate to protect his corporate bonus checks from his new wife. He actually hired a highly aggressive legal team to draft an incredibly restrictive contract just to ensure I could never touch his money if we ever got divorced. I happily signed the document without a single complaint because I was already quietly building my own massive corporate portfolio. He genuinely thought the contract was an impenetrable protective shield for his fragile ego, but tonight it was his absolute financial death warrant. I slowly untied the dark blue ribbon and let it fall onto the white linen tablecloth. I flipped past the standard boilerplate language until I reached page 42. I smoothed the heavy, expensive paper down with my hand and pointed directly to a long paragraph that was heavily highlighted in bright yellow ink. Let me refresh your memory about the specific legal traps your own expensive attorney set for us, I said, my voice completely steady and commanding. Section 4, paragraph B, explicitly outlines the strict parameters of the morality and financial abuse clauses. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat working nervously as the blood drained entirely from his flushed face. What does that have to do with anything? He demanded, his voice completely losing its previous aggressive volume and cracking with intense fear. I looked down at the highlighted text and began to read the dense legal terminology aloud, so every single terrified guest at the table could hear it clearly. In the event that either party utilizes joint marital assets to knowingly fund, facilitate, or participate in any illegal enterprise, corporate fraud, or criminal embezzlement, all rights to marital property, corporate equity, and spousal support are immediately and permanently forfeited by the offending party. I paused for a brief moment, letting the heavy legal jargon sink deeply into the silent room. Furthermore, the offending party completely waives any and all legal rights to contest the absolute forfeiture of said marital assets in a court of law. I slowly looked up from the heavy document and locked my cold eyes directly onto his sweating face. Do you fully understand what those specific legal terms actually mean in the real world, Marcus? I asked him. You did not just make a few incredibly bad business investments. You actively commingled our marital assets with a massive federal criminal enterprise. He violently shook his head from side to side in desperate, pathetic denial. I never used our personal money for business, he shouted frantically, slamming his hand against his thigh. Blue Horizon was completely separate from our accounts. That is another pathetic, ridiculous lie, I corrected him instantly, reaching back into the dark leather dossier resting on the table. I pulled out a perfectly preserved copy of a cleared bank check from exactly 3 years ago. You used our primary joint checking account to pay the initial corporate filing fees and the expensive legal retainers to establish Blue Horizon Consulting. You used marital funds to literally build the exact shell company you and Taylor used to steal millions of dollars from the Union Pension Fund. You also used that exact same joint account yesterday to buy Everline a vintage diamond bracelet and a custom luxury vehicle, completely exposing us to federal asset seizure. David let out a low, agonizing groan of pure disgust, burying his face deeply in his trembling hands. Everline stared at Marcus with absolute raw hatred, finally realizing he had recklessly dragged her directly into his terrifying criminal web. By using our joint marital funds to facilitate federal wire fraud and massive embezzlement, you automatically triggered the absolute worst penalty in your own prenuptial agreement, I explained, my voice ringing with total, undeniable finality. This highly restrictive contract legally severs you from every single asset I currently possess. You do not get to claim half of Apex Holdings. You do not get a single penny of my massive corporate dividends. You do not get this massive house or any of the luxury cars parked in the garage. This ironclad legal document completely strips you of absolutely everything you thought you owned. You walk away from this 5-year marriage with exactly $0.00. Marcus stared at the prenuptial agreement as if it were a highly venomous snake resting quietly on the dining table. The stark, terrifying reality of his complete financial annihilation was finally crashing down heavily on his shoulders. He was entirely trapped by his own arrogant legal maneuvering. He stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly as his desperate mind wildly scrambled for any possible escape route. Then he suddenly threw his head back and began to laugh. It was a loud, hysterical, completely unhinged sound that echoed violently against the crystal chandeliers above us. The sheer desperation in his breaking voice made his terrified colleagues physically recoil in their heavy leather chairs. He slammed his bleeding hand against the polished wood of the table one more time, glaring at me with absolute madness. "You cannot enforce that," he screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my calm face. "My firm's legal team will completely crush you in court. I am a senior partner." "You are a senior partner." I repeated his words slowly, letting the sheer arrogance of his statement hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "You genuinely believe that your prestigious commercial real estate firm is going to deploy its incredibly expensive corporate attorneys to protect a man who just stole millions of dollars from a union pension fund?" I turned my back on his violently red, sweating face and began to walk slowly toward the head of the polished mahogany table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the dark hardwood floor, echoing like a ticking clock in the dead, silent room. "You are incredibly naive, Marcus. Corporate legal teams exist solely to protect the massive corporate entity from severe financial damage. They absolutely do not exist to protect a toxic criminal liability like you." I reached my designated seat at the very head of the table. Unlike all the other panicked guests, I did not have a shiny silver cloche resting in front of my chair. I only had a single sleek black leather folder resting quietly on the pristine white linen tablecloth. I rested my hands flat against the polished wood and looked down the long, elegant table at the absolutely ruined people sitting trapped inside my house. Everline was still quietly sobbing into her hands, completely shattered by her sudden massive poverty. David was staring blankly at the floor, accepting his brutal fate. Taylor was gripping his hair in absolute panic, knowing the federal agents were rapidly approaching. And Marcus was standing there breathing heavily, desperately clinging to the fragile false illusion of his corporate power. I picked up the black leather folder and flipped it open with a smooth, deliberate motion. Inside rested a single sheet of heavy premium paper. It was not a bank statement or a foreclosure notice or a glossy photograph of an incredibly messy affair. It was a highly official corporate press release scheduled to be published on the front page of the Financial Times at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I pulled the crisp paper from the dark folder and walked slowly back down the entire length of the table until I was standing directly in front of my furious, desperate husband. I held the document out toward his chest. He hesitated for a brief, agonizing moment, his eyes darting suspiciously between my calm, confident face and the heavy paper. Finally, his violently trembling fingers reached out and snatched the document from my hand. Read the bold headline, "Marcus," I instructed, keeping my voice entirely even and completely devoid of any human emotion. Read it out loud, so Taylor and all of your wealthy corporate colleagues can hear exactly what their prestigious firm has been up to today while they were busy insulting my cooking. Marcus looked down at the heavy paper. His eyes rapidly scanned the large, bold black letters printed across the very top of the page. His jaw suddenly dropped wide open, and the remaining aggressive color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost. He opened his dry mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He simply stood there staring at the press release as if it were written in a strange foreign language he could not possibly comprehend. "Since you seem to have suddenly lost your ability to speak, I will gladly read the exciting news for you," I announced, turning my head slightly to address the entire silent dining room. The headline officially announces that Apex Holdings has successfully completed a massive $50 million hostile takeover of your highly prestigious commercial real estate firm. The final acquisition contracts were officially signed inside my massive glass-walled boardroom at exactly 10 o'clock this morning. The few remaining corporate guests sitting at the table gasped loudly in absolute shock. They looked wildly at Marcus, waiting desperately for him to aggressively deny the insane corporate claim, but he remained completely silent. His terrified eyes were permanently glued to the undeniable corporate seal printed heavily at the bottom of the page. "You spent the last 5 years treating me like an uneducated domestic servant." I continued, my voice rising slightly to fill the elegant room with undeniable, absolute authority. "You forced me to bake apple pies and roast chickens for your toxic friends while you openly mocked my intelligence and my rich cultural background. You truly believed that your fancy corporate title made you an untouchable king in this house. But while you were busy playing golf and stealing union money to buy Everline expensive sports cars, I was quietly building a massive financial empire entirely from scratch. I poured my extreme dedication and my relentless, fierce focus into creating a powerhouse holding company that absolutely dominates the commercial real estate market. You drastically underestimated exactly what a determined Black woman can achieve when she operates in total silence and absolute brilliance." Marcus slowly lowered the heavy legal paper. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold on to the single sheet. "You bought my company," he whispered, his voice sounding incredibly small and entirely broken. "I did not just buy your company, Marcus," I corrected him, stepping incredibly close to his terrified, pale face. "I bought the massive parent company that owns your firm and every single lucrative subsidiary attached to it. I am the new permanent majority shareholder of your entire corporate existence. I am the sole powerful person who dictates the financial future of your highly prestigious firm. And as of this very morning, I am officially your ultimate boss. And as of this very morning, I am officially your ultimate boss." Marcus staggered backward slightly, as if the heavy, confident words had physically struck him forcefully in the chest. His terrified eyes darted wildly around the silent, elegant dining room, searching desperately for someone to tell him this was all just a terrible nightmare. But Tyler was looking away in panic. David was still completely broken, and Everline was silently weeping into her hands. He was entirely alone. I did not give him a single second to recover his shattered breath or attempt to formulate another pathetic lie. "As your new majority shareholder and the acting chief executive officer of your parent company, I am utilizing my executive corporate authority right here and right now," I announced, my voice echoing coldly off the polished mahogany walls. "Marcus, you are officially terminated from your position as senior director. You are fired effective immediately." I watched his facial muscles twitch uncontrollably. "You are not being let go with a generous corporate severance package," I continued relentlessly. "You are not receiving a quiet, dignified resignation option to save your public face. You are being completely terminated for severe gross misconduct, criminal embezzlement, and massive breach of fiduciary duty. My private corporate security team is currently standing inside your downtown office building. They have already packed your personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and completely wiped your digital hard drives. Your expensive corner office, the one you constantly bragged about at my dinner table while treating me like dirt, has been entirely cleared out." Marcus shook his head violently, his hands reaching out toward me in a pathetic gesture of absolute denial. "You cannot fire me," he gasped, his voice barely a weak trembling whisper. "I have massive equity in that firm. I am a senior partner. I own incredibly valuable stock." "You owned stock?" I corrected him immediately, shutting down his final desperate hope. "During the massive $50 million hostile takeover this morning, my legal team initiated a comprehensive internal audit of your specific commercial division. The moment we uncovered your massive offshore wire fraud connected to Taylor's fake shell companies, your corporate equity was instantly frozen. Under the strict terms of the executive partnership agreement, any partner caught engaging in federal financial crimes immediately forfeits their entire equity stake back to the parent company. Your highly valuable stock options are completely gone, Marcus. They legally belong to Apex Holdings now." The absolute devastation washing over his sweating face was incredibly satisfying to witness. Marcus had spent his entire adult life building a massive, fragile identity entirely around his prestigious job title, his expensive custom-tailored suits, and his arrogant financial power. Without his lucrative career and his stolen money, he was absolutely nothing. He was just an empty, hollow shell of a man who verbally abused the only woman who ever actually supported him. But I was not completely finished dismantling his fake, untouchable life. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look directly into my cold, unwavering eyes. I did not just send those highlighted bank statements and the incriminating audio recordings to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him, my tone dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper. I also sent a fully certified copy of your extensive criminal fraud to the State Bar Association this afternoon. Marcus let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, clutching his chest as if his heart was violently failing him. He had spent 7 exhausting years in higher education to earn his prestigious legal and financial licenses. It was his absolute proudest achievement, and the primary tool he used to manipulate people. I filed a formal legal grievance reporting your massive ethical violations and your direct involvement in stealing millions from a hardworking union pension fund. I continued smoothly. The Ethics Committee has already opened an expedited investigation based on my undeniable evidence. They will permanently revoke your professional licenses, Marcus. You will be officially disbarred. You will absolutely never work in commercial real estate finance or corporate law ever again. No respectable firm in this entire country will ever hire a disgraced, disbarred criminal. His chest was heaving with rapid, incredibly shallow breaths. His completely ruined life was flashing directly before his terrified eyes. And finally, there is the matter of our miserable, toxic 5-year marriage, I concluded, taking a slight step back from his trembling figure. Since you have completely violated the strict financial abuse clauses of our restrictive prenuptial agreement, I am officially filing for a highly contested divorce first thing tomorrow morning. You are leaving this incredibly expensive house tonight with exactly the clothes on your back. You will receive absolutely no alimony, you will receive no marital assets, and you will receive absolutely no legal mercy from me. The sheer immense weight of his total financial and professional destruction finally crushed the very last remaining piece of his toxic masculine pride. His trembling legs completely gave out beneath him. Marcus collapsed heavily onto the dark hardwood floor, landing violently on his knees right in front of my expensive designer shoes. His arrogant posture was entirely shattered, his face was covered in cold, terrified sweat, and he slowly reached his shaking hands up toward me, desperately preparing to beg. His arrogant posture was entirely shattered, his face was covered in cold, terrified sweat, and he slowly reached his shaking hands up toward me, desperately preparing to beg. "Please, Zara," he cried out, his voice completely breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. We are married. We stood in front of our friends and family and promised to love each other for better or for worse. You promised to stay by my side through everything. I am your husband. I made a terrible mistake, but I did it because the corporate pressure was completely destroying me. I just wanted to provide a beautiful life for us. I wanted to give you this massive house and everything you ever dreamed of having." I looked down at the man kneeling on my floor and felt absolutely nothing but pure disgust. I took a slow, deliberate step backward physically, distancing myself from his toxic, manipulative grasp. "Do not dare weaponize our wedding vows against me now, Marcus," I commanded, my voice remaining incredibly cold and entirely steady. "You completely abandoned those sacred vows the very first time you stole money to buy another woman a diamond bracelet. And do not ever claim you committed federal fraud to provide for me. I provided for me. I bought this massive house. I paid for the luxury cars. I funded your entire fake existence while you actively tried to make me feel incredibly small." He kept his hands raised, tears streaming rapidly down his flushed cheeks, but I refused to let him interrupt me. I had held my tongue for 5 years, and I was finally going to speak my absolute truth. "You want to talk about our marriage, Marcus?" I asked him, gesturing toward the completely ruined dining table. "Let us talk about what this marriage actually looked like behind closed doors. You forced me to stay hidden in the kitchen every single time you brought these parasitic leeches into my home. You loudly complained if the roast chicken was slightly too dry, or if the wine was not chilled to your exact specifications. You belittled my intelligence right in front of Taylor just to make yourself look like a powerful alpha male. You told Everline I was just a simple home cook who did not understand the complexities of the modern financial world." Marcus shook his head frantically, continuing to weep on the floor. "I did not mean those things," he sobbed heavily. "I was just trying to fit in with them. You meant every single word I fired back, refusing to offer him any mercy. You loved keeping me beneath you. You thrived on the false belief that I was entirely dependent on your massive salary. But the best part of your delusion was what I was actually doing while you treated me like dirt. Every time you banished me to the kitchen to bake your ridiculous apple pies, I was sitting at the granite island with my laptop open. While you were playing golf and drinking expensive scotch, I was ruthlessly negotiating global supply chain contracts. While you were stealing thousands from union workers, I was securing millions in venture capital. I built an international multi-million-dollar corporate empire from the exact kitchen where you forced me to wash your dirty dishes." The immense contrast between my massive success and his public criminal failure hung heavily in the air. The other guests remained entirely silent, captivated by the brutal dismantling of a man they once deeply respected. Marcus lowered his shaking hands, realizing that none of his manipulative tactics were going to work tonight. He could not gaslight his way out of a federal indictment. He could not scream his way out of an ironclad prenuptial agreement. He could not manipulate a woman who now legally owned his entire world. I gave you every opportunity to be a good man. I told him, my voice dropping to a quiet, definitive tone. I gave you a beautiful home, financial support, and loyalty. But you chose greed. You chose arrogance. You chose to feed your fragile ego instead of honoring your wife. Now you are going to starve on the exact same plate you proudly served me. Before Marcus could formulate another desperate plea to save his ruined life, the heavy atmosphere in the room shifted. A bright, rhythmic flashing pierced through the tiny metal cracks of the steel security shutters covering the dining room windows. Intense, alternating flashes of bright blue and red light painted frantic shadows across the mahogany walls. A split second later, the distant wailing sound of emergency sirens began to echo down our quiet street. The wailing rapidly grew louder and increasingly deafening, signaling the absolute end of his fake, luxurious life. The wailing rapidly grew louder and increasingly deafening, signaling the absolute end of his fake, luxurious life. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the sheer panic spreading across Everlene's tear-stained face. The reality of the approaching sirens completely shattered the last remaining fragments of her arrogant delusion. She scrambled up from her leather chair, her expensive dress stained with spilled wine. She stumbled around the shattered crystal glass and threw herself toward the head of the table. David reached out weakly, but she shoved him away, desperate to save her own skin. "Zara, please," she begged, her voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of fake humility and raw desperation. "You have to help me. You cannot just let the bank take my massive beachfront estate. I will be completely ruined in my social circles. My prestigious friends will absolutely laugh at me. Just give me a small loan from your holding company. You clearly have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts right now. I will pay you back every single penny. I will even be your best friend. I am so incredibly sorry if I made you feel unwelcome in our family. I was just stressed, and I took it out on you." I stared down at her pleading face, feeling absolute clarity wash over me. For years, I had quietly endured the heavy, suffocating weight of her toxic white privilege. I watched her weaponize her generational wealth against me, using it as a heavy, blunt instrument to constantly remind me of my supposed inferiority. "You are not sorry about how you treated me, Everline," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the approaching sirens. "You are only sorry that the woman you deeply despised is now the absolute sole owner of your entire miserable existence. You do not want a loan to rebuild your life. You want a massive handout to protect your fragile artificial image." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing her. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by pretending your relentless cruelty was just stress," I commanded, my tone razor sharp and completely unforgiving. "Your cruel behavior was deliberate and deeply rooted in your disgusting sense of racial entitlement. You constantly made nasty, underhanded comments about my natural hair. You openly mocked the traditional food my grandmother taught me. You looked at my rich, beautiful black heritage and you saw nothing but cheap ethnic stereotypes, because your narrow, arrogant mind could not possibly comprehend a black woman achieving more success than you ever could." Everline flinched physically, shrinking back under the heavy, undeniable weight of my accusations. Her eyes darted toward the heavily shuttered windows as the loud sirens outside abruptly cut off, signaling that the emergency vehicles had parked directly in my driveway. "You proudly flaunted your old money as if it made you an inherently better human being." I continued, refusing to let her look away from my cold gaze. "But your precious generational wealth was nothing but an incredibly fragile house of cards built on massive gambling debts and toxic loans. Meanwhile, my wealth was built entirely on grueling hard work, relentless late nights, and the brilliant financial legacy of my own family. I am completely breaking the cycle of financial abuse right here in this dining room today. I am drawing an ironclad permanent boundary. You are entirely cut off, Everline. You will not receive a single dime from me or my corporate entities. You and David will face the absolute brutal consequences of your massive financial failures entirely on your own." She let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing against the edge of the polished mahogany table. "Please, Zara," she sobbed hysterically, gripping the white linen tablecloth. "I have absolutely nowhere to go tonight." "You can go exactly where you constantly tried to put me," I replied coldly. "You can go straight to the bottom." The heavy, chaotic silence inside the dining room was suddenly completely shattered. Heavy, synchronized footsteps stomped loudly across my stone front porch. The four massive security guards standing in my kitchen hallway immediately stood at absolute strict attention, waiting for my final command to unlock the house. Tyler whimpered loudly, pressing his back tightly against the far dining wall. Marcus remained kneeling on the dark hardwood floor, his face completely buried in his shaking hands. Then came the sound we had all been waiting for. It was a series of incredibly loud, aggressive pounds against my heavy oak front door. The heavy wood physically shook under the immense force of the authoritative knocking. "FBI, open up right now!" A deep, booming voice shouted from the other side of the heavy door. "We have federal warrants for the immediate arrest of Marcus Miller and Tyler Hayes." I slowly turned my head and gave a single sharp nod to the lead security guard standing in the kitchen hallway. He immediately stepped forward and punched a 4-digit code into the electronic panel mounted on the wall. The heavy steel shutters remained tightly locked over the windows, but the thick deadbolts on the front doors retracted with a loud mechanical clank. The lead guard reached out and pulled the heavy oak doors wide open. A flood of cold night air rushed into the foyer, instantly followed by a dozen armed federal agents. They moved with absolute tactical precision, wearing dark vests with the letters FBI printed boldly across their chests in bright yellow text. Their heavy black boots stomped forcefully across my pristine hardwood floors, tracking in dirt and rain as they swarmed directly toward the formal dining room. The overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement completely suffocated whatever remaining air was left in the room. The elegant dinner party had officially transformed into an active federal crime scene. The wealthy guests who had spent the entire evening mocking me now pressed themselves flat against the dining room walls, completely terrified of catching an obstruction charge. Taylor Hayes was standing near the edge of the dining table, his massive chest heaving with uncontrolled panic. When the first two federal agents breached the dining room archway, screaming for everyone to get their hands where they could see them, Taylor's survival instincts violently kicked in. Instead of surrendering peacefully, he made an incredibly stupid decision. He genuinely believed his physical size and corporate arrogance could somehow overpower trained federal law enforcement. "I am not going to any federal prison," he roared, his voice cracking with adrenaline. He lowered his thick shoulder and lunged aggressively toward the closest agent, desperately trying to shove his way past them and escape through the kitchen. He did not even make it 3 steps. The agents reacted with lightning-fast, brutal efficiency. 2 agents instantly grabbed Taylor by the shoulders and completely swept his expensive leather shoes right out from under him. The massive physical momentum sent Taylor flying sideways across the room. He crashed violently into my antique wooden china cabinet. The heavy impact shattered the thick glass doors, instantly raining sharp broken glass and priceless vintage porcelain plates all over his expensive tailored suit. Taylor hit the floor with a heavy, agonizing thud, screaming in pain as the agents immediately pinned him down. "Stop resisting and put your hands behind your back," an agent shouted forcefully, pressing a heavy knee directly between Taylor's shoulder blades. The arrogant senior partner who had demanded an apple pie just an hour ago was now eating the cold hardwood floor, bleeding from a small cut on his forehead and whimpering as the heavy steel cuffs snapped violently around his thick wrists. While Tyler unsuccessfully fought for his freedom, Marcus had the exact opposite reaction. He was still kneeling on the floor exactly where he had collapsed earlier, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his absolute ruin. 2 federal agents approached him quickly, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts. "Marcus Miller, stand up and place your hands behind your back. You are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement," the agent commanded with undeniable authority. Marcus did not try to run. He did not yell or threaten them with his prestigious legal team. Instead, his entire body simply went completely limp. He surrendered to his pathetic fate with a loud, agonizing sob. The agents hauled him forcefully to his feet, pulling his trembling arms securely behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet room sounded like a final heavy lock securing the absolute end of his life. Marcus openly wept, his tears mixing with the cold sweat on his face. He turned his head, looking desperately at me through his bloodshot eyes. "Zara, please help me," he cried out, his voice completely stripped of all its former arrogant power. "Tell them I am sorry. Tell them I will give all the money back." I just stared at him without a single ounce of pity. "You cannot return money you have already spent buying fake affection, Marcus," I replied coldly. The remaining guests watched in stunned silence as the two men were searched and secured. A tall man wearing a dark suit and federal badge walked into the dining room. He bypassed the terrified guests and walked toward the head of the mahogany table. "Are you Zara?" he asked professionally. I nodded smoothly. "We received your digital files but need to secure the original physical evidence immediately," he stated, extending his hand. I calmly handed the lead agent the master dossier with all the hard evidence. The lead agent took the heavy black leather dossier from my hands with a curt professional nod. He opened the cover briefly, inspecting the first few pages of the meticulously organized financial records and the bright red flash drive resting securely inside. He quickly handed the thick file to a younger agent standing beside him, instructing him to lock it immediately in the evidence safe inside their primary command vehicle. Then the lead agent turned his stern attention to the remaining wealthy guests, who were still huddled together against the far wall of the dining room. "This residence is now an active federal crime scene," he announced, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "Everyone who is not currently under arrest needs to vacate the premises immediately. If we need your witness statements regarding the events of tonight, we will contact your legal representatives tomorrow morning. Now move toward the front exit and do not touch anything on your way out." The sheer panic that washed over the remaining corporate elites was incredibly satisfying to witness. The arrogant men and women who had confidently marched into my home just a few hours ago, acting like untouchable royalty, were now frantically scrambling toward the foyer like frightened mice fleeing a sinking ship. They desperately grabbed at their expensive wool coats and designer scarves, pushing past each other in a frantic, terrified rush to escape the suffocating presence of federal law enforcement. My security guards stood by the open front doors, watching them file out into the dark night. The weather outside had violently shifted perfectly, matching the absolute chaos of the evening. A freezing, torrential downpour had started sweeping across the city. Cold, heavy rain lashed violently against the stone porch and the paved driveway, creating a miserable obstacle course for the fleeing guests. Evelyn was among the first to be pushed out the door by the rushing crowd. She snatched her heavy fur coat from the entryway bench, but in her blind panic she fumbled the thick fabric. The coat slipped from her trembling hands and fell directly into a large muddy puddle, forming on the stone welcome mat. She let out a sharp cry of dismay, but she was too terrified of the armed agents to stop and pick it up. She stumbled out into the freezing rain, her thin designer dress instantly soaked through and clinging uncomfortably to her shivering body. She began to march aggressively down the long, wet driveway, completely forgetting that she no longer had the keys to the luxury vehicle parked there. She took 3 aggressive, hurried steps before the uneven, slippery paving stones caught the edge of her expensive shoe. A loud, sharp snap echoed clearly through the heavy rain. The thin stiletto heel of her $1,200 red-bottom shoe broke completely cleanly off. Everline lost her balance entirely. She pitched forward, her arms flailing wildly in the cold, wet air, and crashed hard onto the unforgiving driveway. Her pristine blonde hair was instantly plastered to her face, and her expensive makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She sat in the freezing, muddy water, completely ruined and entirely homeless, and she began to scream. She turned her unhinged fury entirely onto David, who was slowly walking out the front door right behind her. "Look at what you have done to me!" she shrieked, her voice completely raw and hysterical. We have absolutely nothing, David. We have nowhere to sleep tonight. David simply stood in the freezing rain, staring down at her pathetic, screaming form, completely numb and entirely defeated. He did not offer her a hand to help her up. He simply let the heavy, cold rain wash over his expensive suit, resigning himself entirely to his miserable fate. Behind them, the rest of the corporate parasites faced their own miserable exits. Richard's wife marched straight past her cheating husband, dialing a taxi service and loudly refusing to let him share the ride. Bradley stood near the front gate, shivering uncontrollably as he stared blankly at his mobile phone, completely terrified of the morning stock market opening. Finally, the federal agents began to lead the two arrested men out into the harsh storm. Taylor was pushed out first, still loudly threatening to sue the entire federal government, while the agents practically dragged him toward the waiting armored vehicles. Then came Marcus. He walked incredibly slowly, his head bowed, his expensive tailored suit instantly drenched by the heavy freezing downpour. The cold metal handcuffs were secured tightly behind his back, forcing his shoulders into a hunched, defeated posture. Just as he reached the absolute edge of the front porch, stepping over the threshold of the heavy oak doors, Marcus suddenly stopped walking. He ignored the federal agent pushing him forward and slowly turned his head to look back inside the house one last time. He looked past the armed guards and saw me standing perfectly still in the warm, brightly lit foyer. I was completely dry, entirely unbothered, and radiating absolute, undeniable authority. I was not the subservient home cook he had tried to humiliate. I was the powerful chief executive officer who had masterfully dismantled his entire existence. In that brief, silent moment, looking through the freezing rain, the devastating reality finally crashed down on him. He saw exactly what his toxic arrogance had cost him. He realized with absolute crushing clarity that he had thrown away a brilliant, powerful queen just to chase the empty applause of people who were currently screaming in the mud. The heavy oak doors finally swung shut, completely cutting off the sounds of the freezing rain and the distant wailing sirens. The lead security guard firmly engaged the heavy deadbolts, sealing the chaotic outside world away from my private sanctuary. I stood in the warm, brightly lit foyer and listened as the chaotic, frantic energy slowly drained from the massive house. For the very first time in 5 long years, the suffocating presence of Marcus and his toxic friends was entirely gone. I slowly turned around and walked back down the hallway, my heels echoing softly against the pristine hardwood floor. I stepped through the archway and surveyed the absolute destruction left behind in the formal dining room. It looked like a brutal corporate battlefield. Heavy leather dining chairs were knocked backward and scattered haphazardly across the expansive room. The pristine white linen tablecloth was completely ruined, deeply stained by dark red wine that had spilled from overturned crystal glasses. Shards of broken crystal and jagged pieces of priceless vintage porcelain from the shattered china cabinet covered the floor, reflecting the bright light of the chandeliers above. The heavy silver cloches were tossed aside like discarded metal shields. Scattered among the broken glass and spilled wine were the crisp legal papers, the glossy infidelity photographs, and the severe foreclosure notices that had systematically destroyed 10 arrogant lives in less than 2 hours. I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, observing the specific remnants of their destroyed lives. I saw the shiny brass keys to Everlene's foreclosed Hamptons estate, resting near a dark pool of spilled wine. I saw the glossy photographs of Richard's miserable affair scattered near a broken water glass. I saw the heavy blue ribbon that had bound Marcus' ironclad prenuptial agreement, lying discarded on the wet floor. Every single piece of trash in this room represented a massive toxic lie that I had successfully exposed and completely destroyed. I stood at the edge of the ruined room and took a very long, deep breath. The air no longer smelled like Everlene's suffocating designer perfume or Marcus' stale scotch. It smelled like cold rain, an absolute, undeniable victory. Society dictates that a woman whose entire marriage has just violently exploded should fall to her knees and weep. They expect the betrayed wife to desperately mourn the sudden loss of her husband and the complete destruction of her traditional family unit. I waited for the heavy tears to come, but my eyes remained completely dry. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow or regret. Instead, I felt a massive heavy weight physically lift off my tired shoulders. For 5 entire years, I had systematically shrunk myself to fit inside a tiny, pathetic box designed by a fragile, insecure man. I had constantly dimmed my own brilliant light just so his incredibly weak ego would not feel threatened by my massive success. I had spent thousands of hours secretly negotiating massive global contracts while stirring pots of hot soup just to maintain the domestic illusion he demanded. I had secured millions of dollars in international venture capital while patiently listening to him loudly brag about his pathetic mid-level corporate bonuses. But the exhausting theatrical performance was finally over. The heavy, suffocating mask was permanently off. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane, and I saw a strong, resilient black woman who had survived incredible emotional abuse and emerged completely victorious. I had successfully protected my grandmother's legacy and built an empire that no arrogant man could ever take away from me. I was no longer Marcus' obedient little wife. I was the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, and I was completely untouchable. I did not have to hide my immense wealth, my ambitious drive, or my ruthless corporate intelligence ever again. The massive burden of protecting a corrupt, cowardly man was entirely gone, leaving behind a profound sense of absolute peace. I was finally completely free to exist exactly as I am. The lead security guard stepped quietly into the dining room, carefully avoiding the broken glass on the floor. "The perimeter is completely secure, Madam CEO," he reported, his voice highly respectful. "The federal agents have left the property, and the unwanted guests have entirely vacated the private neighborhood. Do you want us to call a professional cleaning crew to handle this terrible mess tonight?" I looked around the destroyed room and slowly shook my head. "No," I replied, my voice echoing calmly in the quiet space. "Leave the mess exactly as it is for tonight. I want to look at it a little while longer. You and your men did an absolutely flawless job this evening. You are all officially dismissed until tomorrow morning. Please go home and get some well-deserved rest." The large man gave a crisp, respectful nod and quietly backed out of the room, leaving me entirely alone in my massive house. I walked slowly toward the head of the mahogany table, stepping carefully over a discarded silver cloche. I reached my designated seat and looked down at the polished wood. My mobile phone was resting right next to the empty black leather folder. The screen suddenly lit up, illuminating the dark surface of the table. A new text message notification appeared on the glowing screen. It was from my lead corporate attorney, Ms. Sterling. I picked up the phone and read her brief, concise message. "The massive acquisition paperwork has been successfully processed, and the executive board has been completely notified," she wrote. "The commercial real estate firm is officially yours, Zara. What is your first order of business?" I stared at the glowing screen of my mobile phone for a long, quiet moment. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard. "Fire the entire executive board first thing Monday morning," I typed back, sending the definitive message into the digital ether. I locked my phone and slid it deep into the pocket of my tailored dress. I turned my back on the completely ruined dining room and walked down the short hallway, pushing open the heavy swinging door that led directly into my sprawling gourmet kitchen. The massive space was completely pristine and unnervingly quiet. The private caterers had furiously scrubbed every single inch of the imported granite countertops and polished the stainless steel appliances before frantically fleeing the property. The cold, sterile smell of harsh chemical cleaner still lingered lightly in the air, completely masking the warm, comforting scent of the roasted French chicken they had taken with them into the rainy night. I walked slowly to the very center of the room and ran my hand along the cool, smooth surface of the massive central kitchen island. This exact room was supposed to be my permanent domestic prison. Marcus had specifically designed this suffocating narrative to keep me entirely contained and easily controlled. He desperately wanted a pretty obedient wife who stayed quietly out of sight preparing lavish, elaborate meals for his arrogant colleagues while he loudly played the role of the powerful, wealthy provider. He honestly believed that confining me to this culinary space would completely strip away my ambition and make me entirely dependent on his stolen corporate wealth. He fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of this room, and he completely underestimated the deeply rooted power of the women in my family. Marcus looked at a kitchen and saw absolute servitude. I looked at a kitchen and saw the exact birthplace of my entire financial empire. My grandmother did not have a fancy corporate corner office or an incredibly expensive Ivy League education. She had a tiny, cramped kitchen in a deeply segregated neighborhood and an absolutely brilliant mind for complex logistics. She started a small neighborhood catering business using nothing but her incredible talent for authentic Southern soul food and an unwavering, relentless work ethic. I grew up sitting on a chipped wooden stool, watching her effortlessly manage complex supply chains, negotiate fiercely with local grocery vendors, and balance detailed accounting ledgers entirely by hand. She taught me that true wealth was never about wearing expensive designer clothes or driving leased luxury cars like Everline did. True wealth was about owning the actual land, owning the fundamental resources, and maintaining absolute ironclad control over your own financial destiny. When I first started Apex Holdings 5 years ago, I did not use a massive family trust fund or stolen union pension money. I used the modest inheritance my grandmother left me from her lifelong catering business. I sat right here at this exact granite island late at night long after Marcus had gone to sleep in our expensive bed. I analyzed commercial real estate trends, I ruthlessly acquired distressed properties, and I slowly built an untouchable corporate portfolio. Every single time Marcus condescendingly told me to go bake a pie, I simply smiled, walked into this room, and bought another massive commercial building. He thought he was actively suppressing my potential, but he was actually giving me the perfect quiet cover to orchestrate his total professional destruction. He handed me the exact tools to build my corporate guillotine. I walked over to the massive double-door refrigerator and pulled the heavy stainless steel handle. The cold air rushed out, washing over my face and clearing my mind. I reached inside and pulled out a large wooden bowl overflowing with crisp, bright green apples. I carried the heavy bowl over to the central island and set it down with a highly satisfying thud. I opened the deep lower pantry drawers, gathering heavy bags of pure cane sugar, rich brown cinnamon, and premium vanilla extract. Taylor had aggressively demanded an apple pie tonight. He pounded his heavy fists on my dining table and treated me like a cheap hired servant simply because he felt entitled to consume the direct fruits of my personal labor. Marcus had completely expected me to eagerly serve his toxic friends and desperately beg for their shallow, worthless approval. They wanted to consume my energy and leave me with absolutely nothing but dirty dishes and a broken spirit. I pulled a sharp paring knife from the heavy wooden block sitting on the counter. I picked up the first crisp green apple, feeling the smooth, cold skin against my palm. I was finally going to bake the exact dessert they had so loudly demanded all evening long. But this time, the warm, sweet cinnamon apples and the perfect, flaky golden crust were not meant for arrogant thieves or racist parasites. I began to carefully peel the apple, watching the thin green ribbon fall onto the granite counter. I was baking this pie entirely and solely for myself. The kitchen quickly filled with the rich, intoxicating aroma of brown sugar melting slowly into sweet cream butter. I folded the heavy, spiced green apples into the delicate, flaky crust, crimping the edges perfectly, just like my grandmother taught me so many years ago. I slid the heavy glass dish into the hot oven and simply waited. The quiet, steady hum of the expensive appliances was the only sound left in my massive home. There were no barking orders demanding immediate service. There were no condescending remarks about my cultural heritage or my intelligence echoing loudly from the dining room. There was just pure, unadulterated peace. When the oven timer finally chimed, It sounded exactly like a beautiful victory bell. I pulled the golden bubbling pie from the intense heat and let it cool on the granite counter. I cut a generous, thick slice, placing it carefully on a pristine white porcelain plate. I grabbed a heavy silver fork and walked slowly out of the kitchen, leaving the rest of the dessert behind. I walked through the quiet living room and stepped up to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city skyline. The freezing torrential rain was still falling heavily outside, blurring the bright neon lights of the downtown financial district. I looked out at the towering glass skyscrapers piercing the dark night sky, knowing that my holding company now legally owned several of those exact massive buildings. Somewhere out there in that cold, wet city, Marcus was currently sitting inside a sterile concrete holding cell wearing heavy federal handcuffs instead of his custom-tailored Italian suits. Taylor was desperately trying to convince a federal public defender to take his massive fraud case because his offshore accounts were completely frozen by the government. Everline and David were wandering the flooded streets, completely locked out of their lavish life, scrambling to find a cheap roadside motel that would accept a heavily maxed-out credit card. And here I was, standing in the absolute warmth of my fully paid-off mansion, eating a perfect slice of homemade pie. I took a slow, deliberate bite, tasting the sweet cinnamon and the warm, tart apples. I looked directly into the reflection of the dark glass, and then I looked right past it directly at you. Yes, I am talking to you right now. I know exactly why you stayed up late listening to this entire story. You know exactly what it feels like to be constantly underestimated by the people around you. You know what it feels like to sit quietly in a crowded room while arrogant people loudly take all the credit for your brilliant ideas and your exhausting hard work. You have smiled politely while toxic relatives or entitled bosses talked down to you, treating your very existence as an incredibly convenient stepping stone for their fragile egos. Society constantly tells women to be loud and aggressive if we want to be heard in this world. They tell us to fight every single petty battle and fiercely defend our honor against every tiny insult thrown our way. But I am telling you today that true absolute power does not ever need to scream to establish its dominance. True unstoppable power moves in absolute total silence. When they try to force you into a tiny insignificant box, you do not argue with them. You simply nod, you smile, and you quietly buy the entire corporate building that houses their precious little box. You must use their massive underestimation as your ultimate camouflage. While they are busy laughing at you and mocking your quiet nature, you must relentlessly build your empire in the deep shadows. You gather your resources, you secure your complete financial independence, you read the fine print on every single contract, and you carefully lay all the traps. You never have to loudly announce your brilliant strategy to a table full of parasites. Let your undeniable massive success be the absolute loudest noise in the room. Let your heavy bank accounts, your legally binding ownership deeds, and your unshakable peace of mind be your ultimate devastating revenge. When the time is perfectly right, you simply lift the silver cover and let them completely choke on the absolute reality of their own toxic actions. Marcus and his parasitic friends walked into my beautiful home tonight, fully expecting me to bow down and serve them another delicious plate of total submission. They wanted a meal. I gave them a feast of consequences. Happy Women's Day. If you enjoyed this story of absolute corporate revenge and silent feminine power, do not forget to hit the like button right now. Share this video with a brilliant woman in your life who absolutely needs a quick reminder of her immense, unstoppable power. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss another story of sweet, absolute justice. Leave a comment down below and tell me exactly how you are building your own silent empire this year. Would you like me to write another story, exploring the next chapter of Apex Holdings? The story of Zara's meticulously planned corporate revenge is an exhilarating read, but beneath the dramatic dinner party reveals and federal arrests lies a profoundly practical lesson: the immense power of moving in silence. Often when we are underestimated, marginalized, or belittled by those around us, our first instinct is to loudly defend our worth. We want to argue to prove our detractors wrong and to demand the respect we know we deserve. However, this narrative beautifully illustrates that you do not always need to scream to establish your capability. In fact, other people's underestimation can serve as your greatest camouflage. While Marcus and his toxic friends were busy feeding their fragile egos by forcing Zara into the role of a subservient home cook, she was using that exact cover to build a multi-million-dollar empire. She didn't waste her energy fighting their petty daily insults. Instead, she channeled her brilliance into tangible, undeniable success, reading the fine print, securing capital, and outmaneuvering them in the real world. By the time they realized who she truly was, they were already caught in her trap. Her success spoke much louder than their arrogance ever could. The core takeaway is to stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. True empowerment comes from recognizing your own worth and doing the quiet, relentless work required to build your own solid foundation. When you are deeply rooted in your own reality, the arrogance of others becomes a weakness you can outgrow, rather than a cage that confines you. Let your tangible accomplishments be your absolute loudest statement. Take a moment today to identify one area of your life where you can stop arguing your worth and start quietly building it instead.